great impact and that we can have these next 2 days. And another very impactful person who's here today, and is also the co-founder of a favorite tool of mine. It's called Trello. It helps you organize your life. And actually in my office, people call me Queen Trello because I am so addicted to this specific tool. I can only recommend it. So Joel did not only change my life, he also changed, and I see this every day in our sites, where the developers use Stack Overflow, this online platform where they help each other learn, where they help each other level up and become even better within their skills. And you should very much look forward to his view upon why is it that Stack Overflow works. Because I'm sure that you all know that developers is a certain kind of personality. And sometimes they need a little bit of help getting to network, getting to talk to someone that they don't know. So let's welcome Joel, not with the Danish style clap clap, but with a big actual applause.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. There are, by the way, if you're standing in the back, there are seats in the front, so come forward and take them. Okay, what do you want to talk about? Does anybody use any programmers in the audience? Can I raise your hand if you're a programmer? Okay, 1, 2, 3, keep them up. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, there's a few. Say 10. That's good. Do you use Stack Overflow? Anybody here? Cool. All right. I like it. Everybody. I'll start a little bit with the story of Stack Overflow, since Stack Overflow is now about 10 years old. We've been doing this for exactly 10 years, I think, this month. I started the site with a person that I met online named Jeff Atwood, and he was a blogger. He went by the name of Coding Horror. I think he still blogs on that name. And together, we came up with this idea of fixing the internet. The internet 10 years ago, if you had a programming problem, was not a very hospitable place. And what you would find is kind of old discussion forums and conversations that had taken place in the past. And a lot of them you had to pay to read. And so we thought, let's make it questions and answers and simplify it. And in that time, over 10 years, one way of thinking about that is, I don't know, dog years, 70 dog years. I don't know why anybody cares about dog years. We like to count the number of times that we helped people get out of Vim. So there's a question on Stack Overflow, how do I exit Vim? And it has been viewed now 1.5 million times. And so I've probably saved the world just through that, several thousand decades of lost productivity as programmers try to, I guess you could just kill the terminal now, but there is an exit command to Vim, and you can find it on Stack Overflow. When Jeff and I first started Stack Overflow, we had no idea how popular it was going to be, if anybody was going to use it. It made sense to us. I thought, I had a blog, a few people read that. I thought some people would read it, but we didn't really realize just how successful it was going to be. And at some point, I think we still are one of the only sites, popular internet sites, to use a lot of Microsoft technology. And so we were invited to speak. This was maybe 3 months after Stack Overflow started. We were invited to speak at a conference in Las Vegas that Microsoft was putting on. And I thought, how bad could it be? I've spoken in front of tens of people before. This is going to be a little bit larger. And when I got out there and I was standing backstage, I sort of peeked on at the audience. This was there's a hotel in Las Vegas called the Venetian. This hotel is so large. This is where other hotels go to stay when they go on holiday. They stay at the Venetian. It's a huge, huge place. I peek out on stage, and it's a room the size of like Ireland, approximately. And it turns out that there were 5,000 people there. And I was rather nervous, and Jeff was even more nervous. And before we went on stage, I said to Jeff, Jeff, here's what I'm going to do. I read that what you should do is get the audience involved, ask them a question. So I want to ask them, how many of you have ever used Stack Overflow? And again, we had been in business for about 3 months, and he said, oh my God, Joel, you can't ask that question. There's going to be like 7 people in the room. There are going to be 4 people. Joel, do you want -2 people to raise their hands when you ask how many of you use Stack Overflow? And he looked at me sort of very angry, and I said, all right. But when we got out, I couldn't resist, and I did ask that question, how many of you use Stack Overflow? Raise your hand, and we got like a third of the room, which was thousands of people, and it was really kind of amazing, and I think that was the moment when Jeff realized that this was going to be a thing, and that is incidentally the last time I could even ask that question, really, of a room of programmers, do you use Stack Overflow? Because today that's just like asking, okay, how many people use Gravity? Raise your hand if you use Gravity, please. It's such an important part of programming, and that is really heartwarming, is the number of questions that have been answered and the amount of time that we've saved people through Stack Overflow. We sort of estimate that every time somebody finds an answer on Stack Overflow, it saves them about a half an hour of additional research or debugging time. And so Stack Overflow, through the answers that many of you have provided, has propelled the world much further into the future because of that time. I did a calculation based on the number one Stack Overflow contributor, who a fellow by the name of John Skeet, and he has written, I think, 36,000 answers on Stack Overflow or something like that, and our estimate is that he's helped people 250 million times, that he's helped a developer. So let's do a quick calculation here. There are 20 million programmers in the world, 20 million software developers, 250 million times. That means each and every one of you, if you are a software developer, you have been helped by John Skeet 12 times. If you saved about a half an hour each time, that means that this one person on Stack Overflow has already saved you 6 hours of your life. In other words, if John Skeet hadn't existed, the world would be 6 hours in the past. In other words, we've moved 6 hours into the future just based on his answers on Stack Overflow. And that's pretty amazing. And then multiply it by the thousands and thousands of people that are contributing, and all the times that developers are finding help on Stack Overflow, probably 7 or 8 times a month per programmer. And that's really cool. So that's a little bit of the story of Stack Overflow. Now, another thing I want to talk about, which is a question I often get at this point, is why is there only Stack Overflow for developers? Why don't we have this for everything? And we kind of do. And for a while, we thought that Stack Overflow for every topic in the world would be the greatest thing in the world. We would have it for heart surgeons. Recently I had heart surgery about a year ago. Thanks for asking. I'm fine, since you asked. I don't think anybody in the surgery profession or any doctors ever use anything even remotely like Stack Overflow or like online. I mean, how would that work even? You're sitting there sort of in the middle of the surgery and you're like, hey, nurse, I suppose you wouldn't use a laptop yourself if you're in the process of surgery. You might ask somebody to look something up for you. But, I mean, what the programmers are doing really is like, what is that flappy thing that this fellow has in his heart right next to the thingamajiggy? It's just going like this. It's like, is that a mitral valve? Oh. Does he need it? Let's just take it out and see what happens. Because that's really what programming is like. In fact, very little of programming happens in the style of other professions. I don't know why that is. We don't have documentation as programmers that you can read and understand. If you've ever tried to read documentation, has anybody read a book? Anybody? No, I mean about programming, like trying to teach you how to do something. We don't. We just dive in and, just start to try to code, and then when you have a problem, you Google it. If you do read the documentation, it's unbelievable. Like, let's say, I don't know, you're reading up on Node, and there's documentation on Node, and so the first thing you want to do is create a new Node project. And sure enough, chapter 4 is about how to create a Node project. And you start reading that, and the first thing it says is, ensure that your computer is turned on. And that's great. And then there's a little section about, if your computer is asleep, wake it up. Some computers distinguish between hibernating and sleeping. Sometimes you have to wait longer. And this has nothing to do with it. This is always in the documentation, a lot of this nonsense. And you get past that, and then it says, ensure that the keyboard is in front of you and beneath your fingers. And you read that for a while, and then it says, if you do not have fingers, please see Appendix 4. Appendix 4 is not available in Canada. If you're in Canada, call Dell, and there's a phone number. And again, it doesn't matter, but you go on and on and on, and you flip forward. Then finally, aha, step 11, create the Node project. And that's all it says. It doesn't actually tell you how to do it. And again, turns out that the person writing the documentation does not actually know how to do the thing that the documentation is supposed to be teaching you how to do. And so they've done sort of what a school child does when you have a test and you get a question that you're never going to be able to answer. What was the Cold War? Cold War. I don't know. The Cold War was very important because unlike the warm war or the hot war, it was lower in temperature. And that's what documentation is like. And unlike, for whatever reason in the medical profession, maybe things don't change as fast. We work on the assumption that we're going to train up the doctors, and then we're going to send them in, and then they're going to cure people. With programmers, it's not that at all. With programmers, it's like, why don't you just start and type some code, and the documentation is there for some legal reason. But hopefully you'll be able to figure it out on your own, and when things go wrong, you'll make it work somehow. Now, one thing about Stack Overflow, which I want to talk about, and I think it's really relevant, is that it's got a bunch of weird rules. And I'll keep coming back to rules. And I actually kind of want to make a theme about that because the Minister of Science was just up here talking about all the laws that he's not going to create. The laws that are created by legislators are just a tiny part of the rules that guide society and that cause the future to happen the way that it happens. One thing I noticed when I landed at Copenhagen is you don't have Uber anymore, which is because of a law, and that did change something in a little bit of a way. But the rest of the world, where they're still using Uber, a programmer at Uber can make a change to the user interface of Uber and have much more of an impact on the future of the world than the legislators can have by trying to pass laws. And in fact, all that code that's getting written and it's getting run, when it runs, those are actually probably 90% of really the laws in determining how things are going to work. And sometimes it's very small things, and sometimes it's very large things. And we can look to code for, in a lot of cases, code is going to sort of define the future. By definition, when programmers write a script, when they write a line of code, that code will run in the future. And because the code that we're running today is so entwined with our lives, it really makes a big impact on the future, how that thing gets written. If the Uber code tells you there, at one point they introduced a feature in Uber to save time where they would tell you to cross the street because they'd be like, go over there and wait there for the car, don't just stand here. And now all of a sudden, because some code was written, people are walking across the street. It's a small thing times a million. All of that code is really influencing the future. And when it starts to hit social networks, that's when you really notice it. Where are you getting your news from? What do you think is important? What do you think is actually going on today? Well, that was determined by an algorithm. What kind of algorithm? Something some Facebook programmer came up with. Does the Facebook algorithm say something about electing a certain, orange person in the United States? It doesn't actually. It just uses machine learning to try to get you more stimulated and clicking on more things. So we don't even know why the Facebook algorithm, what it's doing. It's doing a bunch of matrix multiplication. And then it's creating the future. And that's why being a programmer and being a coder is super important. Now, let's look at who gets elected to be coders. I mean, look around. These are a lot of developers in the room, and look at your neighbors. And you may notice that we're pretty much going on about 95% male here. And it's Scandinavia, so you have an excuse, but we're also probably at about 97% Caucasian. And that is not that's not representative of the world in any way, shape, or form. And we're seeing this has become kind of a big problem everywhere, is that the world of coding is not representing the world, and nevertheless it is creating more legislation for how the world shall work in the future than the Minister of Science over here is creating. So, with all due respect, because you can do good things if you are the Minister of Science. You just can do a lot as a coder, too. So that's an issue that's of concern to us at Stack Overflow, because Stack Overflow, for some reason, because none of that documentation works, is really how we bring new developers into the fold and how we create new developers, because they have to learn on Stack Overflow, and that's where they come to learn. So I want to talk a little bit we talked about rules. Let me talk a little bit about rules on Stack Overflow. And what's interesting is whenever you join a new community or go to a new place, you discover that they have weird and inscrutable rules. They always do. They have to. They have to have some kind of rule. And the newbies arrive, and they say, why do you have this rule? I don't like this rule. because they don't know. They don't know they don't know the system. They don't know how it kind of works. The simplest example I think I can give you, how much time do I have? I could give you a lot of examples. A simple example I noticed is I went to a nightclub in New York called Output, and it's very good, and they have great techno music and DJs from places like from Berlin. And they have signs up all over the place that say no cell phones. And that's all it says. It just says no cell phones. And I thought, this is really strange. This is very inconvenient. How do I text my friends? How do I put this on Instagram? How do I take a picture to show that I was at the famous nightclub? But that is the rule. And in fact, there are bouncers walking around, and they're very nice, and they won't take your cell phone away. But if you do have a cell phone out, they will point to the sign, and they are bigger than you. And so you put your cell phone away. Nobody knows why. I went to this club several times without knowing why this rule existed until I went to a different nightclub, a more famous nightclub, a much more Manhattan nightclub called Le Bain, and it does not have this rule. And when you go into Le Bain, there's a bunch of Spanish tourists walking around making Instagrams and doing Snapchats. And 3/4 of the people in the club are having an interaction with people that are not in the club through their phones that is not immediate. They're just posting something for later. And you can't even have a conversation with people. You can't dance with them. You can't interact with the other people because they're on their phones. And so this is an example of a rule. You don't notice it at first. You don't know why the rule exists, but it makes it a better club. And they figured this out, and they just make the rule, and they don't bother explaining it to you. And if you don't understand it, go to Le Bain. Enjoy. It's not that fun. And that's the idea of these rules. Now, we got rules like that on Stack Overflow, too, and every community does as well. I'll give you one of the examples on Stack Overflow. The rule is, please try to provide some sample code that illustrates your problem. When you ask a question, provide some sample code, and provide the smallest possible amount of sample code that you can that just illustrates your problem. So what we don't want you to do is take 3,000 lines of code and dump it on a file server somewhere and give us a link and say, debug my code for me. Why do we not want that? Because what we've learned over the years is that if you try to narrow down your problem to the minimum single line of code or 2 lines of code that illustrate your problem, you'll probably fix it by yourself. We're trying to teach you how to fix your own problems through the rule that says use a minimum amount of code. And then people come and see this, and they look at Stack Overflow, and they say, I don't like that rule. Why do you have that rule? It's so much easier. Why don't you just allow me to just put all my code, and then you can figure out where the problem is, and that would be better. This is not my favorite rule. And we get a lot of new people coming on Stack Overflow and insisting that they really know better than us about this particular rule. And just like there's new people that go to Output and really think that putting themselves on Instagram is the best way to enjoy a nightclub, and they're all wrong. And we try to explain it to some of them, but we don't have a lot of time. And so what happens is that newbies come, and boom, they get hit smack in the face with a whole bunch of rules about how to be successful on Stack Overflow, which happens to be how to be successful as a programmer, in my humble opinion. Okay, so with all these rules, what are we trying to accomplish? What are we really doing here? What we're trying to do is we're trying to teach people to be better programmers. We're trying to create a better environment for learning, and we're trying to make Stack Overflow work. And in the case of Stack Overflow, we have another goal that not a lot of people realize, and that goal is to create an artifact for the future, because there's a person asking the question, but there are going to be 1,000 people that find this question later when they do a Google search. And they're all coming along, and they're going to want to read this answer. And so we're trying to make the questions and the answers serve the purpose of the next 1,000 people to come along, not just the original person asking the question. And so obviously, if the question is just read my 3,000 lines of code and tell me where the bug is, that can't possibly help anybody else unless they happen to have written those exact same 3,000 lines of code, which they didn't. So understanding the goals. And then what happens is when we try to enforce these rules, we can't always explain them to people. And to a newbie, the rules are unwelcoming. And this is where it comes back to that issue of legislation and the importance of that, which is that when people join Stack Overflow, if they are immediately hit with a whole bunch of you're doing it wrong, they will feel unwelcome. And because Stack Overflow is so intrinsic and so important to programming today because the documentation doesn't work, making people feel unwelcome makes them feel like they are not going to be successful as developers. And so if they had any reason to doubt that they were going to be able to fit in as software developers in the world today, this is just going to make it worse, and it's just going to make it much, much harder. And so if you're a girl learning how to code in school, and like the other boys, you go on Stack Overflow, but unlike the other boys, when you look around at the field of coding, what you see is, excuse me, a lot of other boys and not a lot of other girls, then the combination of, wait a minute, why am I the only girl here? Am I doing something wrong? And God, this is hard, and there are all these rules, and people are being mean about the rules. They're not being mean because you're a girl. They're being mean because you didn't put the minimum amount of code. But it doesn't matter. It's just going to make it very, very hard to participate in the field, and it's going to drive people out of the field. And so in many ways, unfortunately, Stack Overflow, like many other online communities, but I won't name them, but all of them, is actively, by being, it doesn't even have to be antagonistic or unwelcoming to drive people out of the field, especially women and minorities. And the end result is that we don't have all that code for the future that we're creating is not really representational of the future that we want to create, because it's not representing people, because it's not being written by everybody. It's only being written by a small fraction of them. And so what we discovered is that, and it's just about a year ago that we came to this realization, that it's not enough to not be unwelcoming. We actually have to be positively welcoming of newbies. Somebody told me something that blew my mind. They said, I asked a question on Stack Overflow, and then the answer that somebody wrote was, this is easy, and then they had the answer. But the words, this is easy, made me feel like I must be dumb. Like, if it's not easy for me, I thought this was really hard. And so when the know-it-alls on Stack Overflow are telling me this should be easy, that made me feel like in some way I'm doing it wrong, or I'm in the wrong field, or this is probably just too hard for me. And so, so that's one of the things I think that creates a problem on Stack Overflow, and creates a problem in the world of software developers that we're going to work on. And we have a project inside Stack Overflow called Welcome Wagon. And we really think that the difference between making Stack Overflow a welcoming place and making Stack Overflow an unwelcoming place is not that hard. Just teaching people not to say things like, this is easy, having nicer ways of enforcing the rules that we've already created and more welcoming rules, and then actively making an effort to be welcoming to people that are obviously new to programming are all things that we can easily do just by kind of tweaking the software and modifying the software, and then tweaking the community. We have a new code of conduct, and I hope that what that leads to is a much more representational world for software developers in which more people participate over years, and we actually get kind of a democracy in the way that the code for the future is written, both on Stack Overflow and everywhere else. If you're a participant in open source communities, you can do the same thing. But I think that's really important for the future, and that's really important for the code that gets created, and kind of the democracy that we're creating online, in which everybody is following their phone around everywhere, doing things that software developers define for them. So that's it. Thank you very much. I hope the next 10 years of Stack Overflow are great, and thank you for listening to me.